I was lying beneath the floor of the old ranger cabin, wedged into the narrow space between the beams. Dust clogged my nose, but I was afraid even to sneeze. Above me, only a few centimeters from my head, the floorboards creaked. Heavy, measured footsteps. Whoever was in the room wasn't in a hurry. He knew I was there. A flashlight beam cut through the cracks in the floor, blinding me for a moment. I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling my heart slam against my ribs like a trapped bird. The footsteps stopped directly above me. Silence followed, so absolute that I could hear the whistle of my own breathing. Then came a scraping sound. Someone was slowly sliding a knife into the gap between the boards, right above my face. These are 3 true scary stories about working in national parks. Story 1. I worked for the National Park Service for 7 years. Most of that time I spent in the north, in places where cell service is a luxury and the nearest town is 4 hours away by dirt road. My job was to patrol remote areas of forest, check backcountry campsites, and monitor the condition of hiking trails. It was peaceful work for someone who enjoys solitude. Until that October. It began during the 3rd week of my assignment in the Blackwood sector. It's a vast stretch of old-growth forest where the trees stand so densely that even at noon the light never fully reaches the ground. My base was a small cabin on the slope of a hill, equipped with a radio, a supply of canned food, and an old wood stove. That evening I returned from a 10-hour patrol. My legs ached and my face burned from the cold wind. I lit the stove, set a kettle on it, and sat down to fill out the logbook. The usual routine. Weather, clear, north wind. Trail conditions, normal. Incidents, none. I was about to go to bed when I noticed something. On the windowsill outside the cabin lay a stone. A small, perfectly round river pebble. There would have been nothing strange about it except for one detail. The nearest river was 8 miles away over rough terrain. I thought maybe some hiker had left it there as a joke, though I hadn't seen another human being in 3 days. The next morning there were 3 stones. They were arranged in a row on the porch railing. All identical, gray and smooth. I threw them into the bushes and went on patrol. All day I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. You know that sensation when the back of your neck begins to prickle? I kept turning around, but all I ever saw were endless rows of pine trees. By midday I reached the Deer Creek campsite. It was empty, but the fire pit was still warm. Someone had camped there and left very recently. I examined the ground for tracks. Boot prints led from the fire toward the forest. Size 42 or 43, Vibram-style tread. Standard hiking boots. But there was one problem. The stride was far too long. Whoever made those tracks would have had to be nearly 8 feet tall. I followed the trail. It led deep into the forest, far from the marked path. After half a mile, the tracks simply ended. They didn't fade. They didn't grow faint. They just stopped in the middle of a clearing. There were no trees nearby to climb. No rocks. Just flattened grass. I returned to the cabin after dark. On my table, directly on top of the closed logbook, lay the same river pebble I had thrown into the bushes that morning. The door was locked from the inside. The windows were closed. I checked the lock. No signs of forced entry. I sat on the bed gripping my service shotgun. I didn't sleep that night. Around 3 in the morning I heard a sound. It wasn't rustling. It wasn't a breaking branch. It was whistling. Thin, melodic. It seemed to come from above, as if someone were sitting on the roof of my cabin, softly whistling a lullaby. I ran outside with a flashlight. No one was there. Only the freezing air and silence. But when I shined the light against the wall of the cabin, I saw fresh scratches in the wood. Deep gouges running from the foundation all the way up to the roof. As if something heavy and clawed had climbed up the wall. The next 2 days turned into a nightmare. I stopped making long patrols and limited myself to a 500-meter perimeter around the cabin. The radio started malfunctioning. Instead of the dispatcher's voice, I heard only static. Through the static came strange sounds, water splashing, whispers in a language I didn't understand, and that same whistling. On the third day I found something else. 100 meters from the cabin, on an old stump, stood my coffee mug. The same mug I had left on the table inside the cabin. It was filled with fresh blood. Beside it lay a neat stack of 12 river stones. That was when I understood it wasn't a joke. Something, or someone, was playing with me. Closing the circle. I decided to leave. The nearest ranger station was 20 miles away. If I started at dawn, I could reach it by evening. I packed my backpack, checked my weapon, and lay down for a few hours of rest. I woke up because of the cold. The cabin door stood wide open. A man was standing in the doorway. He was extremely thin. Unnaturally tall. He wore an old ranger uniform faded almost gray. His face. I can't forget it. The skin was stretched over the skull so tightly it looked translucent. His eyes were enormous. No pupils. Just two cloudy white spheres. He didn't move. He just stood there staring at me. Then he began to grow. Literally. His joints cracked like dry branches. His spine bent backward as his body stretched, filling the entire doorway. I fired. Once. Then again. The shotgun blast in that confined space struck my ears like thunder, blinding me for a moment. When the smoke cleared, no one was standing in the doorway. Only a handful of river stones scattered across the floor. I ran all night. I didn't look back, even when I heard that cursed whistling behind me. I reached the ranger station by morning, exhausted and barely conscious. My supervisor listened without interrupting. He didn't laugh. He didn't ask questions. He simply poured me a cup of coffee and said, "You're the fourth ranger this season to leave the Blackwood sector. We won't be sending anyone else there." I quit the next morning. Now I live in a city apartment on the 10th floor. But sometimes, when it rains outside, I find a small, perfectly round river pebble on my windowsill. Story 2. People often ask why I quit working in mountain search and rescue. The pay was good. My colleagues respected me. And the job kept me outdoors. But there are things that can't be explained rationally. Things that change you forever. This happened in Olympic National Park. It was late November. The rainy season was beginning to turn into early snowfall. We received a call about a missing hiker near Hurricane Ridge. Male. 45 years old. Experienced outdoorsman. Failed to return on schedule. My partner Mark and I set out at 4 in the afternoon. Our plan was to reach Cedar Grove Base Camp, stay the night there, and begin a detailed search at dawn. The sleet turned the trail into slippery mud. We walked mostly in silence to conserve energy. Mark was a veteran. He had worked those mountains for 15 years and knew every rock. But that evening he seemed unusually tense. "Do you hear that?" he asked, stopping beside a fallen tree. I listened. Through the wind came a strange sound. It sounded like a child crying. But mechanical. Repeating. "Probably a cougar," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "Cougars sound different. Sharper." "No," Mark said quietly. "That's not an animal." We followed the sound. It led us to a small ravine filled with fallen branches. There, among the debris, lay the missing hiker's backpack. It was torn to shreds as if by enormous claws. But the strangest thing was inside. Everything had been arranged by color. Blue socks beside a blue jacket. A red medical kit beside a red mug. The food had been removed from its packaging and laid out in perfect circles on the ground. Crackers. Nuts. Raisins. All arranged in strict geometric patterns. "That's not a bear," Mark whispered. "A bear would have eaten everything." We began searching the area. Our flashlights swept across wet tree trunks. Then I saw him. 10 meters away, behind a thick spruce tree, a man stood there. He was wearing a bright orange jacket, the same one mentioned in the missing person report. He stood with his back to us, rhythmically banging his head against the tree. Thud. 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 "Hey! Can you hear me?" Mark shouted, stepping forward. The man didn't turn. He kept slamming his head against the tree. But now faster. The blows blended into a rapid pounding. "Sir. We're search and rescue. We're here to help." Mark stepped closer and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. At that moment the man spun around. It was the missing hiker. But his face. It was gone. Literally gone. Where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only smooth skin like wax. And from beneath that skin came the mechanical sound of a crying child. Mark recoiled and fell backward. The thing, I can't call it a man, stepped toward him. Its movements were jerky, like a broken puppet. It didn't walk. It lurched forward in short bursts, freezing for a fraction of a second after each movement. I grabbed Mark's jacket and dragged him backward. We ran for the trail. Behind us I heard the pounding. The creature was smashing its head against every tree it passed. Thud thud thud. The sound was getting closer. We burst onto an open section where the trail ran along a cliff. In the beam of my flashlight I saw 3 more figures standing ahead of us. All wearing hiking clothes. All standing with their backs to us. All smashing their heads against the rocks. "Jump!" Mark shouted. We slid down the steep slope, risking broken bones. We ran all the way to the parking lot without stopping. When we reached the truck, Mark started the engine with shaking hands. We called for backup. The next morning police and a tactical team searched the entire area. They found the backpack. They found the carefully arranged food. But there were no people. No tracks. The official report stated that the hiker had died from hypothermia, and Mark and I had suffered a shared hallucination caused by stress and hypoxia. But I know what I saw. A week later Mark killed himself. His suicide note contained only one sentence. "They whistle under the skin." I resigned the same day. Now I work in an archive in a windowless basement. But sometimes, when the building grows too quiet, I hear a rhythmic pounding behind the walls. Thud. 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 Story 3. This happened last summer in Yellowstone. I was working as a ranger at a remote outpost near the Norris Geyser Basin. My shift was at night. Usually it's boring work, making sure tourists stay on the boardwalks and don't wander into boiling springs. That night was quiet. And extremely hot. Steam from the geysers hung in the air like a thick curtain, making it feel as if you were standing inside a giant sauna. The smell of sulfur filled your lungs. Around 2 in the morning I noticed movement on the thermal camera. Someone was inside a restricted area right at the edge of Porcelain Basin. It's a dangerous place. The ground there is as thin as eggshells, and beneath it is boiling acid. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out. Walking the boardwalk through the fog isn't pleasant, but I knew the route by heart. "Hey! Get back on the trail!" I shouted, pointing the beam toward the movement. The fog parted for a moment. I saw a figure. A woman wearing a long white dress. She was standing directly on the fragile crust of the geyser field. She wasn't sinking. Anyone her weight should have fallen straight through. She slowly turned. Her dress was wet, clinging to her body like a second skin. Then I realized something. It wasn't a dress. It was her skin. It hung from her in long white strips, exposing bright red steaming flesh underneath. She took a step toward me. Her feet left black burned marks on the white crust. She didn't walk. She glided. And a sound came from her like red-hot iron plunged into water. A violent hiss. I froze. Every survival instinct screamed for me to run, but my legs felt numb. She stopped 5 meters away. Her face. It wasn't there. In its place was a single massive burn wound, steam pouring out of it. "Help me," she hissed. Her voice sounded like gas bubbles bursting in thick mud. She reached a hand toward me. Her fingers were long, charred at the tips. And then I noticed something else. Behind her in the fog stood others. Dozens of figures. Men. Women. Children. All of them without skin. All steaming. All hissing. They began surrounding me. I stepped backward, tripped over the railing of the boardwalk, and fell. My flashlight flew from my hand and rolled across the planks, illuminating their ruined feet. I jumped up and ran for the ranger cabin. Behind me I heard their collective hissing. It grew louder and louder, becoming a roar. I burst into the cabin, slammed the door, and locked every bolt. I crawled into a corner under the table and covered my head with my arms. Then what I told you at the beginning began. Footsteps on the porch. Heavy, wet slapping sounds. Someone approached the door. I could hear hot flesh sticking to the wood. The wood began to char from unbearable heat. Then they started seeping inside. Not through the door. Through the cracks in the floor. Thick, biting steam filled the room. It was alive. It formed shapes, hands, faces, reaching toward me. I hid in the crawlspace beneath the floor, climbing through a small hatch. I locked it behind me and stayed perfectly still. They walked above me. Searching. I could see their shadows through the cracks. One of them stopped directly overhead. Hot, oily liquid began dripping from the boards. Then something sharp slid into the crack above me. It wasn't a knife. It was a long bone finger stripped of skin. It moved slowly back and forth, trying to feel for me in the darkness. I stayed there until sunrise. When the sun rose, the steam faded and the sound stopped. I climbed out. Inside, the cabin looked as if a steam boiler had exploded. The walls were burned. The furniture had melted. I didn't wait for the end of my shift. I just walked to my car and drove away. I didn't even return the keys. Later I learned that in the 1920s an accident had occurred there. A group of tourists had stepped off the trail. The ground collapsed beneath them. They were boiled alive in an acidic spring. Their bodies were never recovered. I no longer work in forests. Now I work in an office in downtown Los Angeles. There are always people here. Always noise. And the air is very dry. But every time I take a shower and the bathroom fills with steam, I freeze. Because in that steam I begin to see the outlines of faces. And I hear someone on the other side of the shower curtain whisper softly. "Help me. If you had been in my place, would you have stopped to help?" I was sitting on the kitchen floor in the corner, my back pressed against the cold metal of the refrigerator. In my hands was an old hunting knife. My fingers had gone numb from how tightly I was gripping the handle. Outside, behind the thin wooden door of the cabin, someone was standing. I could hear his breathing. It was heavy and wet, with a wheezing rasp deep in the chest. Then a voice spoke. "David, open the door. I'm very cold. Please." It was my mother's voice. She died 7 years ago. I knew with absolute certainty that the thing behind the door wasn't her. But the intonation, the slight break at the end of the sentence, was identical. Then I heard a scraping sound. A long, bony fingernail slowly dragged across the wood, leaving a deep groove. The creature on the other side of the door wasn't trying to break it down. It was simply waiting for me to break first. These are 3 true terrifying stories about what actually happens deep inside national parks. I worked in Yellowstone for 5 years. My sector was the Norris Geyser Basin. They call it the porcelain basin because of the white mineral crust that covers the ground. The air there always smells of sulfur, and a deep rumbling constantly comes from beneath the earth, as if something alive is shifting far below the surface. It was the end of September. Almost all the tourists were gone. My job was to patrol the boardwalks at night. My responsibility was to make sure no one stepped off the trails. The crust of earth there is as thin as an eggshell, and beneath it is boiling acid. That night the fog was especially thick. It hung over the geysers like a heavy blanket, muffling every sound. I walked with my flashlight, listening to the sloshing water in the thermal pools. Around 2 in the morning, I noticed something strange on my thermal scanner. There was a shape about 300 meters away from the boardwalk, deep in a restricted area where no human was allowed to enter. The shape was cold. Completely blue on the screen. But it was moving. I stopped walking. There are no animals in Yellowstone that are colder than the surrounding environment. Even snakes look different on the scanner at night. But this shape had the outline of a human. And it moved in jerks, pausing for several seconds after every step. I pulled out my radio. Post 4, this is Mark. I see an intruder in Sector Echo. Moving toward the stick spring. Over. Only static answered. I checked the battery. Full. I tried again. But the radio produced a strange sound. It wasn't interference. It was whispering. Dozens of voices speaking at the same time in a language I didn't understand. I turned the radio off and aimed the beam of my powerful flashlight toward the shape. For a brief moment, the fog parted. Someone was standing there. It was a man wearing an old ranger uniform, the kind they wore in the 70s. He was standing knee-deep in boiling mud. But it didn't seem to bother him. His skin had a strange grayish tone, like the color of dried concrete. Slowly, he turned his head toward me. His eyes. They weren't there. Instead, there were 2 deep hollows filled with the same gray mud. He opened his mouth. Thick steam poured out. I didn't wait. I turned around and started walking back toward the ranger station. I didn't run. In Norris you never run, you can fall straight through the crust. But I walked as fast as I possibly could. 5 minutes later I realized something was wrong. I was walking in circles. I should have reached the parking area by now, but instead the stick spring was in front of me again. The same sign. The same fallen pine tree. I looked down at my footprints on the boardwalk. They were wet. But beside my footprints were others. Bare footprints. And they were coated in gray residue. I turned the thermal scanner back on. The blue shape was now only 10 meters behind me. It was just standing there. Waiting. I switched off my flashlight. In complete darkness, Yellowstone sounds different. You begin to hear the water moving beneath the ground. And then you begin to hear that water whispering your name. A smell reached me. It wasn't sulfur. It was the smell of old, stagnant water trapped inside a sealed crypt. Cold air brushed the back of my neck. I spun around and swung the flashlight as hard as I could. The metal struck something soft and yielding, like wet clay. There was a splash. I turned the light back on. A pile of gray mud lay on the boardwalk. It was slowly moving. Trying to reshape itself into the form of a human hand. I ran. Forget the rules. Forget the danger of falling through the ground. I burst out into the parking lot, jumped into my truck, and locked the doors. The entire windshield was covered in gray handprints. Small ones. Children's handprints. I quit my job a week later. In my official report they wrote, hallucinations caused by hydrogen sulfide exposure. But sometimes, when I take a shower and the bathroom fills with steam, I see the same gray handprints appearing on the mirror. And they're always fresh. In Yosemite, there are places even the most experienced guides refuse to enter. One of those places is the 10 Lakes Canyon. The acoustics there are strange. Sounds bounce off the rock walls in such a way that you can never tell where they're actually coming from. At the time, I was working in a search and rescue team. We were looking for an 8-year-old boy who had fallen behind his parents during a hike. 3 days had already passed. There was almost no chance left, but we kept searching sector after sector. My partner, an old grump named Bill, was moving about 50 meters to my left. We communicated with hand signals so we wouldn't scare the missing kid if he was nearby. Around noon I found his shoe. It was standing right in the middle of the trail. Perfectly clean. The laces were tied in a tight double knot. There was no blood inside. No dirt. Just a shoe, as if it had been taken straight out of a box and placed there. I picked it up and called for Bill. Bill, I found a shoe. Sector 12G. Come over here. Bill didn't answer. I looked toward the place where he should have been. He wasn't there. The forest in that area wasn't dense enough for him to disappear. I should have been able to see his orange jacket. I waited a minute. Then another. Silence in Yosemite is a bad sign. Usually you always hear birds, or the wind moving through the treetops. But here it was quiet. Quiet like a vacuum. I started walking in Bill's direction. 100 meters later I found his radio. It was lying on a rock. The antenna was bent at an unnatural angle, as if someone had twisted it with their fingers. And then I heard Bill's voice. It came from behind a massive boulder. Hey, take a look at this. There's something weird here. I walked toward the boulder. Bill, what the hell did you drop your radio for? I looked behind the rock. No one was there. Only a steep slope leading down toward a creek. I'm down here, Bill's voice said again. But now it came from above. From the top of the cliff. Come up here. The view is great. I lifted my head. A person was standing on the edge of the cliff. He was wearing Bill's jacket. But he stood in a strange way. His knees were bent backward. And his arms hung lower than his knees. Bill? I called out, feeling my stomach tighten. The person on the cliff began to laugh. But it wasn't Bill's laugh. It sounded like the noise a radio makes when someone presses the transmit button. Mechanical. Broken. A stuttering burst of static laughter. Then he began to climb down. Not using the trail. He simply started walking down the vertical cliff face, moving his limbs like a gigantic insect. His joints cracked loudly. The sound echoed through the canyon. I ran. I didn't look back. But I could hear it following me. It wasn't running. It was jumping. Heavy impacts slammed into the ground, sometimes to my left, sometimes to my right. It was playing with me. Then I burst out onto an open clearing. And that's when I saw the staircase. An ordinary wooden staircase. Standing in the middle of the forest. It led nowhere. Just steps rising up into the sky. I knew about these staircases. In search and rescue nobody talks about them out loud. But every ranger knows the rule. If you see a staircase in the forest, don't go near it. Don't even look at it. Just walk past it. But the creature behind me forced me to stop. It stepped out to the edge of the clearing. It was Bill's jacket. But inside there were no bones. The fabric sagged, as if it had been filled with wet sand. Its face was a pale, flat disc with no features. Someone had crudely drawn eyes and a mouth on it with charcoal. It raised an arm and pointed at the staircase. "Climb," it said. But the voice wasn't Bill's. It was the voice of the missing boy. "Mom's up there." I closed my eyes and started counting to 10. That's an old trick they taught us to control panic. When I opened my eyes again, the creature was gone. The staircase was gone too. I found Bill 2 hours later. He was sitting under a tree 3 miles away from that place. He was in deep shock. His jacket was on him. But he had no memory of how he got there. The boy was never found. A month later the case was closed. Bill quit the service and moved to another state. And I still can't walk in the forest alone. Because I know something. The staircases are still out there. And they're waiting for someone to decide to climb. I thought the worst was already behind me. But 2 weeks later something happened that was even worse. I was on duty in an old ranger cabin on the edge of the park. A storm had rolled in. The wind was knocking down trees, and the rain had turned the ground into mud. I was alone. The radio was silent because of the lightning storm. Around midnight I heard a knock on the door. 3 clear knocks. I walked to the window. Outside there was no one, only a solid wall of rain. I went back to the table. Then the knocking came again. This time it was coming from under the floor. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the hatch that led down to the crawlspace. It was empty. Just damp earth and the foundation posts. I was about to close the hatch when I saw it. In the far corner, deep in the shadows, something small was sitting there. It looked like a person. But its skin was completely white. Almost glowing. It sat with its arms wrapped around its knees, rocking slowly back and forth. "Who's there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. The creature raised its head. It had no hair. No ears. Only enormous black eyes that covered half its face. "I'm very cold," it said. It was my mother's voice. The same voice I heard later while sitting beside the refrigerator. I slammed the hatch shut and shoved a heavy dresser over it. At that exact moment something started pounding on the door. It wasn't just one person. It sounded like an entire crowd had gathered outside. They scratched at the walls. They pounded on the windows. They whispered my secrets, things no one could possibly know. They knew the name of my first dog. They knew what I cried about when I was 10 years old. They used my memories like weapons. I sat on the floor gripping the knife, listening to my mother's voice begging me to let her in. "David, I brought your favorite apples. Remember how we used to pick them in the orchard? Just open the latch." I remembered. But I also remembered that our orchard burned down together with the house. By morning everything had gone silent. When I stepped outside onto the porch, I saw that the ground around the cabin was completely trampled. But they weren't footprints. They were handprints. Thousands of palm prints leading from the forest to my door, and back again. I left the state that same day. I changed my name. I changed my phone number. Now I live in a city where it's never completely silent. But last night I came home and saw something on my kitchen table. An apple. A red, ripe apple. Exactly like the ones from my childhood. I live on the 12th floor. The windows were closed. The door was locked. Now I'm sitting in the corner, staring at that apple. I know the knocking will start soon. 3 clear knocks. If you were in my place, would you open the door?